Let him be like a little Johnny. Okay, so you're talking about the mythologies of Peru's sea peoples, and that's quite interesting because usually when we speak of Peru, can you see me?
Mm-hmm.
Good. When we speak of Peru, what comes to your minds maybe a little bit more than sea? Mountains. Okay, Machu Picchu, fantastic. You're thinking of very gigantic, impressive-looking mountains because Peru is filled with those. It does have some of the greatest mountains in the world, although you might not know that the highest mountain in the Andes, do you know what country it's from? Peruvians hate when I mention this. This is the place where my family is from. Argentina. Aconcagua is actually on the Argentine border. But that's all really rather silly because back in the day when Tawantinsuyu, when the Inca Empire ruled, there was no Peru, there was no Argentina, there was no Ecuador. It was all Tawantinsuyu, which is the name the Incas gave the area, meaning the land of the four quarters. But long before the Inca came, there were the peoples of the sea. Do any of you have any idea how long the Inca actually ruled in Peru before Spain showed up with its rather hard leather and iron boots? About 100 years. Very good. This is an excellent audience. You all get an A. Very good, because it was not an ancient empire, folks. The thing is, Peru and, the Incas and the Spanish really both became solar empires around the same time, which is the end of the 15th century. Did Spain exist before the 15th century? No, there was no place called Spain. There was Castilla, Aragon, Andalusia. They were all separate kingdoms that were united when two really nasty sovereigns, Fernando and Isabel, got married. And then it becomes one country and it becomes a solar, I say that because their symbol was the sun, the symbol of the empire was the sun, a military solar empire. The Incas, like the Spanish, did not become consolidated as an empire till the late 15th century. So you have a rather weird encounter between these two solar empires that were just formed. It was a very bitter and bloody encounter. But Peru cannot be reduced only to Spanish and Inca. And those, of course, are the two categories you have in your head. Let me just mention, by the way, Peru has a very interesting and varied African population as well. We're not going to get to that tonight. We'll get to it another time. We will come back to Poison Pen. But the peoples of the sea, these were cultures, Native American cultures, that were there for thousands of years before the Incas showed up. And back in the 1940s, some of you have heard me mention it before, here I go again, when Thor Heyerdahl came to Peru. He was rather surprised to hear of one particular god he had never heard of before, because when you think of the gods of Peru, you think of Inti, the god of the sun, because that was a supreme deity for the Incas. And suddenly, Thor Heyerdahl was hearing about this person called Kon-Tiki. Who was Kon, he asked. What's a Kon? Kon is a god without bones, he was told. Thor Heyerdahl, for those of you who don't know, is a very famous Norwegian anthropologist and considered the greatest anthropologist of Latin America in the 20th century. He was a magnificent anthropologist. He thought, okay, a god without bones. Now this is interesting, he said. This does not sound Inca to me. And the native peoples on the southern coast of Peru said, well, it's not Inca. We're not Inca. Thor Heyerdahl said, I know you're not Inca, you're Nazca. Tell me more about Kon. Well, he has no bones, and he sometimes takes the form of a killer whale. That's very interesting. If any of you take a look at Nazca Indian art, And for those of you who want to Google it, or go and look at it in a museum, Nazca, Nazca Indian art, is not at all like the Inca's solar art. There is no sun. There are sea creatures. And one of the creatures who appears all the time is what we call a killer whale. Is a killer whale a whale? What is it?
Mammal.
It's a cousin of what cute little pudgy animal, right? We think porpoises and dolphins, aren't they adorable? Give them a hug. Unless you're really strange, you're not going to want to hug a killer whale. But they are cousins. In fact, the killer whale is a type of dolphin. It's a deeply intelligent animal. Deeply intelligent. It reads books. But it is a highly intelligent animal, and it's one that inspired both interest and a certain amount of fear in the peoples of Peru's southern coast. And so they looked at it as a god, as a manifestation of the spirit of the sea. Now, do any of you know about Peru's coastline? Peru has a huge coastline, yeah? But you know, water everywhere and not a drop to drink? It's one of the most arid coastlines in the world. In the world. And so you have this weird combination of salt water and hardly any rain. And I say this so you can understand why it is that where civilization begins in Peru, which is not in the mountains, it's on the seacoasts. And it will go from the seacoast to the mountains. And of course the Inca, who were no less imperialist than the Spanish, will claim that they brought civilization. Yeah, well, we heard the conquistadors say that too. They did not bring civilization. Like the conquistadors, they received civilization from an older source, and that source was the sea. But you know, history is often written by those who win. So the image that was projected in Peru for many, many years, once you would no longer say, well, the Spanish brought civilization. Ouch, we know that wasn't true. So the Inca brought civilization. Well, ouch, that isn't true either. In fact, you have many different civilizations. I think we have to start looking at plural models of civilizations. And Thor Heyerdahl, who came to Peru right after World War II, was very, very tired of bloodshed and imperial ideas. And he had a different idea for society. And his idea is actually here on this first slide, because Thor Heyerdahl's idea for society was not the melting pot. We use that term a lot here in the United States, right? The melting pot. We'll all become the same. Thor Heyerdahl had another idea, which was, it's a good thing to keep our differences. And we can live together and keep our differences. Okay, that's interesting, because some people might say that's politically incorrect, or it actually, I might tell you, is an easier way to live culturally. Your next door neighbor might not be like you. You might be Christian, you might be Jewish, you might be Muslim, you might be an atheist, you might really want to hang on to your belief system, and you can live next door to somebody who thinks differently. So Heyerdahl's image for society was the rainbow. And a rainbow looks beautiful. Why? Because it has different colors in it. Peru, culturally, is a type of rainbow. It's a rainbow where two of the colors tried to overtake everything else for many years. Just Spain or just the Incas. But what we know now in Peru as a living society and from Peruvian history is that 5,000 years before the Incas showed up and 5,500 years before the Spanish showed up, there is an unbroken chain of older cultures. And many of those older cultures worship the sea and not the sun. Let me throw something interesting out to you. And this is something that always confused Thor Heyerdahl, because he saw this in many places throughout Latin America, and being Scandinavian, he looked at this also in the context of Scandinavian society. Why is it that when we worship the moon and the sea, frankly, we tend to be slightly nicer people? We don't go on, we don't go on imperial expeditions. The minute we take solar symbolism, think of ancient Rome, okay, in a European context. In a New World context, the Incas or the Aztecs, who God knows were every bit as bloody as the conquistadors. why is it we go wrong when we start worshiping the sun? What happens with this? Is there something basically nicer about the moon? Is there something about lunar worship which is connected with the sea? Somebody tell me why.
It's the male and female.
Well, we have the male and female, and the female principle is almost always connected with the sea. But we know women can be awful too. That nasty queen in Spain who expelled the Jews, expelled the Muslims, and began the conquest, Isabella was female. She was female identifying with a solar empire. What is it about the sun? You know, sometimes other anthropologists would kid around with Thor Heyerdahl, and they would say, well, you're Scandinavian, so you hate the sun. So you're justifying moon and sea worship, because you never see the sun. But that's not really fair. There is, or what is that yellow disc in the sky? There is, I have to say, from an anthropological point of view, big fat word just meaning the study of culture, from a cultural point of view, you are going to notice when you look at many civilizations, something militaristic happens when you go solar. Now that being said, I'm not saying the cultures of the sea were pacifistic. They had their armies. Their armies either were used for defense against the solar cultures, or they fought among themselves. That was very common. Like infighting among lunar sea people. But empire seems to be an issue of sunlight. Okay. So, the lands of the moon, doesn't that sound great? So, let's get to know a lesser known landscape in Peru. If you go to the north of Peru, you have a culture which predates the Incas by over 1,000 years. And those are the Moche. Now, please take a look at that picture, because to understand what I say, because I know a lot of this material is unfamiliar. I really want to focus on the images here that Kendra has selected for us, because to get to know the Moche, you have to know them visually. Notice what's on her head. What do you think that might symbolize? The moon. The half moon. Okay. Notice what she has in one of her hands, crescent moon. And notice that in the other hand she has a full moon. So we have this idea of the moon goddess. Her name is Sian. She is still worshipped by the Yunga people of Peru, who are really the descendants of the Moche people. And what do you think the connection could be with the phases of the moon and a woman?
Cycle.
Let's say it, let's not be puritanical. Menstruation.
Menstrual cycle.
Menstrual cycle, yeah. What an idea, what a concept. So, the menstrual cycle, the concept of fertility, the different phases of a woman's life, before menstruation, during menstruation, after menstruation, all of them are aspects of the female. And Sian incarnates the 3 stages of life. The wise woman, that's the post-menstrual. The fertile woman, that's the menstruating one. And the younger virgin, premenstrual. Now this idea of one woman divided into 3, the Moche people had it, so do the Welsh. If you look at ancient Welsh mythology, you know the Morrigu. Okay? One woman divided into 3 different persons. So the phases of the moon and the female are going to be very important for the Moche. And one of their supreme political rulers, notice I said political, is the goddess who serves, Sian. So what period are we talking about? From the 1st century to the end of the 7th. Okay, this is 800 years before, they end 800 years before the Incas even show up. So now we know there's a very long trajectory before the Incas come with their sun god Inti, who supplants everything. And don't even ask what happens when the Spanish Conquest occurs. So we are with peoples of the moon. And Sian is the supreme goddess. The sea is the cradle of Pacific civilizations. Remember that Peru is a Pacific culture. Not Pacific as in pacifistic. Pacific as in coming from the sea. So let's talk for 1 minute about where the native peoples of Peru come from, because as with the native peoples all over the Americas, they have a series of different origins. Where do you know some of the native peoples coming from originally? Roughly 18,000 years ago. Far north? Yes, very good. Go up through Canada, turn left to the Bering Strait, and go into Siberia, follow the mammoths, which would be hard these days, who no longer exist. Many native peoples have ancestry going back to Central Asia. That was one branch of migration that came over, roughly 18,000 years ago, and then every 3,000 years till the Ice Age. But we know that after the Ice Age, more native peoples came over, and they tended to settle farther and farther up north. And the last group of people to come over from Siberia, we now call the Inuit. And they were misnamed the Eskimo. Eskimo is actually a nasty word placed on the Inuit by their Cree Indian cousins. Did you know that Native Americans dislike each other just as much as white people and black people? Yes, they do. They do indeed. So the actual name is Inuit, and Eskimo is not a particularly nice name. So that's one group of immigration, and some migrated far down to what we now call Latin America. There were other migrations as well, and they're particularly in Peru, Ecuador, and Chile. When the native peoples today want to find out where they're from and they do their DNA. Have you ever done your DNA? Swab it, right? It's very interesting. You should never be racist because you're going to find somebody. I have that, yeah. Everybody does. It turns out that many, many people in Peru, whether they think they're Spanish or they think they're Native American, are also Polynesian. There were many, many waves of Polynesian migrants who came and settled on the coast and intermarried, or just had crazy love affairs. The human race, because there is just one race. I hate, and I agree with Thor Heyerdahl, we've got to stop using this term of the races. There's one human race. And as Thor Heyerdahl once said one night after having too much schnapps, there were two drinks he used to keep drinking to get himself through work. One was aquavit and one was schnapps. And after too many schnapps, or too much schnapps, he said, one race because we can all mate with each other. Well, that's true. That's the human genome. So, lo and behold, most Peruvians, whether they think they're totally Spanish or totally Native American, or mestizo, Spanish and Native American, or African, are also Polynesian. So there's a huge connection with the islands of the Pacific. And every single culture that begins on the Peruvian coast going back 5,000 years, because the oldest culture in the world, in the New World, people, is in Peru. It's called Caral, C-A-R-A-L. And Caral is on the coast. And all of these cultures are seafaring cultures. Okay, so now stop only thinking about the mountains. It begins with the sea, and they will go from the sea to the mountains. The Moche civilization, there you see them now after all this, begin in 100, and by 800 they've kind of collapsed, fighting among themselves. Now this is the lunar characteristic, okay? The solar characteristic, there's nothing genetic about this. This is more a philosophical choice of which deity you worship. But it seems to go with certain political tendencies. Solar, conquer your neighbor. Lunar, fight with your family. And through infighting, basically, they collapse and they're going to be replaced then by more sun-worshipping cultures. If you want to read a bit more about the Moche, or you're just looking around online or in the local library, I would recommend that you look for the words Moche priestess, because what we now know from archaeology is that the supreme figure in Moche culture was a woman, and she was called the owl priestess, and she was above any of the kings. Is there any question? Anybody? Go for it.
Is there a fourth moon?
You're wonderful.
Look, it's
You're fantastic.
Yeah.
There is indeed a fourth orb.
decreasing.
That's the sun. In Moche iconography, remember these are lunar people, and their descendants, the Yungas, are also very lunar. And there's a bit of a contest in today's Peru between which one of the native civilizations has priority. So how do the lunar civilizations kind of de-emphasize Inca or Spanish influence? That's the sun. It's the dark orb. Because it's the lesser of the orbs.
It has the shape of a increasing moon rather than decreasing.
It does have the shape of
The
a
other
moon.
side of the full moon.
It does indeed, but I don't want to fall into the temptation of saying that's what it is, because in Moche and modern Yunga, again, their descendants, in their iconography, the way they de-emphasize the sun is this way. Why is there a need to do that? In modern day Peru, have any of you ever visited Peru? Is anyone here? Okay. So, you know that Peru definitely sells itself in terms of tourism as El País de los Incas, or the Inca country. And if you are a native person in Peru, you have a fairly difficult time, less than before, but you still have a difficult time making your voice heard if you do not belong to the dominant Quechua speaking minority, which in the Native American world is the majority. So you see, everybody can become an imperialist. I want you to notice that she has several hands. Now, are any of you familiar with Hindu iconography? You know the goddess Kali, you know the god Shiva? Well, something that you might find interesting is that in Peruvian iconography, the pre-Inca and the post-Inca lunar cultures, the gods are pictured with many, many hands and many manifestations. And we're going to see later on, we'll see, or I'll tell you about, she's kind of hard to picture, another goddess with 5 arms. Gods and goddesses are pictured multi-armed, multifaceted, because the image is the moon and you are always changing your cycle and your phase. Very good question. Any other question before we move on? Please, feel free. No?
Where did the Inca come from as a culture?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So what's funny in history is that often the people most associated with a country, and maybe the people who often make the loudest noise, are not actually native to the country. Okay, King Philip II of Spain in the 16th century, who was the most Español de los Españoles, was actually only 1/4 Spanish. He was Flemish and Portuguese, 25% Spanish. But oh my God, if you told that to him, no, he was puro Español. Well, he was Spanish culturally, but he certainly wasn't really Spanish. Well, guess what? The Incas and Inca culture, although it will become irrevocably identified with Peru, because Peru is what they conquer. And Cusco is the city where they established their empire. They are originally from Lake Titicaca, and that is in Bolivia.
They come from the mountains.
They come from the area right underneath Lake Titicaca on the Bolivian side. And they begin what is a war of conquest, no less than what Spain will do in the 1530s. And when they arrive in Cusco, it is important for them to establish their dominion over the people who are already there, who were lunar-worshipping people. And one of the ways they will do that is to create a myth that they were actually born out of what's called Pacaritambo, which means the cave of the dawn in Quechua. And they will situate that cave close to Cusco. Modern day linguistic research has proven that the dialect of Quechua that the Incas spoke is native to Bolivia. And the language that was actually spoken when the Inca arrived in Cusco is another language called Puquina. But, you know, we invent myths, right? And in our minds, those myths are really hard to get away from. And so the Incas, who symbolized Peru, actually are from present-day Bolivia. Now, of course, modern-day politics gets into this. And I'm always going on, and I will always go on about the nasty things Europe did to Latin America, but I have to tell you, in Latin America, we also do nasty things to each other. It's called the human genome, again. Human beings are a pain. I used to think dolphins were better, and then I started watching the National Geographic documentary to show you how dolphins have in-groups and out-groups.
Yeah.
And they flip their fin at you. So, because there are problems today politically between Bolivia and Peru, nobody likes to remind anyone that the Incas come originally from what is now Bolivia. So you see, modern day politics is inescapable. But once it was all lunar. Now, you know, you have to watch out sometimes when you show photographs to 18-year-old students in university, because they're like, is that a real photograph of Moche priestess? It's for recreation, honestly. Well, what we would like to show you is, although there is no connection between Moche civilization and ancient Egyptian civilization, because ancient Egyptian civilization had died by the time the Moche begin in the 1st century. There are a number, so we have chronological incompatibility, okay? But there is philosophical similarity. And that had to do with the cult of the sun. Now, again, the first person to notice that was Thor Heyerdahl. Because although the Moche were lunar worshipping, as their civilization starts to deteriorate, this is a very interesting point, worship of the sun comes in. And as worship of the sun comes in, it displaces the moon, and as it displaces the moon, it displaces the female. Now, in early Egyptian civilization, you know that some of the early pharaohs were women. Some of you may have heard of Hatshepsut, right? Beautiful with her nice long beard. She wasn't the only female pharaoh. As Egyptian culture developed, the female pharaoh disappears, and all the pharaohs are men. As Moche culture starts to disintegrate, the worship of Sian, the moon goddess, is slowly pushed out, and solar deities take over. That's very interesting, because that is also part of Egyptian culture. It's also, I have to tell you, part of ancient Japanese culture. Before Japan becomes the solar worshipping culture of the samurai, it was a lunar, sea worshipping culture, and the great figure of lunar, much more peaceful, sea worshipping Japan was the mythical empress Himiko. And then Himiko was displaced by all those nasty solar deities. You know, making you feel like really nasty when you see the sun tomorrow morning. Max Uhle was a very great German archaeologist. He fled the Nazis in the 1930s, and he settled in Peru. And then he was deported back to Germany and imprisoned till the end of the war, and then finally came back to Peru. He devoted his life to the study of these ancient peoples, and he saw a connection between the Moche and another group of native peoples whom I lived with and have a tremendous respect for and studied, and I still study them. I learn a tremendous amount from them, the Mayas of Central America. And Max Uhle, looking at Peruvian civilization, said, okay, he's actually the first one to say this. He says this before Heyerdahl, and to a certain degree, Heyerdahl will be able to take some of Max Uhle's theories and really put them into practice. He'll run with them, but I have to give credit where credit is due. The first person to kind of perceive this is Max Uhle. And he says, well, if we look at the Moche, we see a similarity with the Maya because like the Maya, they have a lunar calendar which goes in cycles. And like the Maya, they see continuous cycles. And like the Maya, and unlike the Inca, and unlike the Aztec, they were not afraid of eclipses. Okay, now here's something interesting. The Moche and the Maya, more than the Aztecs, who were terrified of eclipses. Every time there was an eclipse in Aztec Mexico, there would be wailing and screaming and human sacrifices because you had to placate the sun god. The Incas did not practice human sacrifice on that scale. And frankly, there's a debate about whether the Incas even had human sacrifice, though they certainly had nasty conquering armies. But eclipses were a terrifying time for the Incas because remember, their chief deity was Inti, the sun. So a solar eclipse was horrifying. But the sea peoples of Peru, like the Mayan Indians in Central America, were pretty blasé about eclipses because their lunar calendars predicted them.
What about lunar eclipse?
Lunar eclipses and solar eclipses. Any eclipse. They were totally blasé about it. And they shared the same mythology. When I use the term mythology, I could be using the term religion, because remember, one man's religion is another woman's mythology. There you go. They believed it was the sun taking a bite out of the moon, or the moon taking a bite out of the sun. And they would just bite each other back and forth. And because both the Moche and the Maya were great mathematicians, they observed the stars, they observed the solar bodies, and they could predict, as you can, with regularity, when eclipses would happen. That was more scientific than many places in Europe at that point, which also had many superstitions. Although certainly, and I have to say farther up in the north, in Scandinavia, where you had very great astronomers like Tycho Brahe and Copernicus, they were also realizing, wait a minute, this is just a cycle. Every time there's an eclipse, we don't have to go running around screaming, ah! Well, you can. You have nothing better to do. But it happens with regularity. So Max Uhle said, well, this is interesting because we have cultures that are more focused on time and chronology and less afraid of natural events. And female priestesses. Now this is something Max Uhle focused on very much because you have to understand also a lot of his theories came from his earlier studies of pre-Christian Germanic society. And Max Uhle's theory was that in German culture, in the pagan period, women had a much better status. And in fact, that's true. Because the major god was a goddess in the pagan period, and her name was Suna. That's where you get the word sun. The sun was a woman in the pagan period. And then later, under the period of church domination, it changes to being identified with a male. So Uhle also had this idea in his head of, what is this connection between female, lunar, and when he began to see it in the native cultures of the New World, he also felt this is really a philosophical issue. You identify with the moon, there is a greater appreciation of the feminine. Female priestesses in Moche culture and in Mayan culture were very, very prominent. In fact, we know in Mayan culture, where there was not human sacrifice, rather than sacrificing human beings, the Mayan kings used to give their own blood sacrifices. Now that was a little painful. They would take a spondylus shell, which you'll see at the end of our presentation, and they would prick themselves on a part of their body I'm not going to mention. But you're the king, you can do it. We now know that Mayan queens did the same. So there was this idea of using your genitals from where your fertility is as your blood offering. But it did not reach the stage of human sacrifice. So we also have a different attitude towards that. Okay, a different attitude towards bloodshed, I would say. It's not that there's no bloodshed, but it's certainly attenuated in the lunar cultures. Owls. Who here has a thing for owls? Okay. let's get away from the idea of owls as sinister, as connected with horror movies, as that's not where it's going to. What do you associate an owl with? What are your mythological connections?
Wisdom.
Ooh, let's hear one-on-one.
Knowledge.
Knowledge, wise old owl, good. Knowledge, what else?
Night.
Night. Is that at all sinister? The connection with the night? No, just night. Night, knowledge, anything else?
Patience.
Patience. Okay, that's very, very interesting. Because in Mayan Indian culture, the owls are the patient creatures that wait for the gods of the underworld, Xibalba, to make idiots of themselves and get drunk so they can take the daughter of the gods of Xibalba up to earth and save her. They have strategy. We know through, have you ever heard of a great animal anthropologist by the name of David Attenborough?
Oh, yes.
So David Attenborough studies birds and people. And, you know, he got his start studying bower birds, you know, those amazing birds that build little bowers. And he was trying to see if he could annoy a bird. Well, he discovered he could. Because he would look at the bowers and change a leaf. And, you know, you have to watch the cameraman filming this, and the bird is giving him a really dirty look. And then David Attenborough would walk out, and the bird would go, turn the leaf over, and leave the bower and wait for a female bird, the birdess from the bower is dedicated. David Attenborough was fascinated by that when he first saw that as a young man. These birds are not stupid. Let's not use the term bird brain. And what is this connection between birds and knowledge that so many cultures have in all of the Native American cultures, solar or lunar? The birds are associated with tremendous knowledge. For the lunar cultures, it's the owl. What is it for the solar cultures? What bird will they take? The eagle. Just as in Europe, right? The symbol of the Habsburg Empire, right? The double-breasted eagle, the double-headed eagle.
Totally.
Take a look now at this image, owls, moons, and feminine symbolism. So, in the Moche kingdoms, notice I said kingdoms because they were never united. It's another characteristic of lunar peoples. They're always divided. You know who the lunar peoples of Europe were? Who were the people who worship the moon? The Celts. And when Julius Caesar insults them, what does he say? They're so disorganized. They're disorganized, but they sacked Rome. Sometimes disorganization has its place. So they were never united in one kingdom, neither the Celts in Europe nor the Moches or the Mayas in the New World. But in all of their kingdoms, the supreme figure is the owl priestess. And she was a spunky lady because she had power above the king. So the only parallel we have to this really would be in the Bible, and what Christians call the Old Testament, and what we, I'm speaking as a Jewess, call the Tanakh. Who's the one person who can tell the king what to do? The prophet. Only the prophet. Remember when King David decides to have his whatever with Bathsheba? When he sees that beautiful woman taking a bath on the roof, although honestly, if you're taking a bath on the roof, and he does what he does with Bathsheba, and then he says to the prophet Nathan, I'm going to build God a temple in Jerusalem, and Nathan says, the hell you will. The hell you will, David. You will not dare to build him that temple because you shed the blood of an innocent man, Bathsheba's husband, Uriah. You'll never build that temple. That temple will be built by who? Solomon. And what does David do? Does he order Nathan beheaded? No. What does the book of Kings say? He puts his head in his hands and weeps. Okay, so the prophetic power in biblical Jewish culture. This is a parallel to what we're going to see among the Moche and the Maya, and also the Celts with the Druids. Okay, because the Celtic princes and the Celtic kings had to submit to the Druids. Have you ever heard of Arthur and Merlin? Mm-hmm. Even if Arthur and Merlin never lived, I like to think they did, but let's say they didn't. The story still brings up a model. Okay, so she is more powerful than the king. And by the time the Moches kind of collapse as a civilization in the 9th century, and their descendants, the Yungas, who will be another civilization that comes from the Moches and then intermarry with the people of the Amazon. So we have the jungle coming into this now. They will retain the jungle symbolism, the female symbolism, the owl symbolism. So who are the Yungas? And now here's the question that I know you've been burning with all night. Who are the Yaoyos? I know before you just said, I'm not letting this woman go. So the Yungas and the Yaoyos will give us many, many interesting stories and much interesting philosophy. And if you want to go visit the incredibly beautiful place where they live in Peru, because these are not museum pieces, these are living peoples, then you have to go right in the middle between the sea and the mountains in a very beautiful valley called Huarochiri. Don't worry about writing that down as we go through the beautiful PowerPoint Kendra has made for my lecture. You're going to see Huarochiri written. Kendra can now spell in several innumerable interesting languages. And we're going to see where the Yungas and Yaoyos come from. But what I want you to remember right now is that they are in the midpoint between the cultures of the sea and the cultures of the mountains. What type of strength do you think that will give them? What strength do you have when you're neither 100% this nor 100% that? That can be a difficult situation. It can also be an incredibly liberating situation. Tell me what's good about that situation?
You can be a communicator between the two cultures.
Bingo. You must be a communicator between the two cultures, because the only way you're going to survive that situation is if you understand both cultures enough to speak with the two of them. If you've ever visited the Chinatown in San Francisco or New York, and you talk with American-born Chinese, there's a very good Chinese friend of mine who calls himself an ABC, American-born Chinese. You're navigating two cultures at once. American-born Chinese are totally bubblegum-chewing Americans. And they're also completely members of the Chinese culture. And so they go back and forth between Chinese culture, with its emphasis on filial piety and respect for the elderly, and American culture with its obsession for the young and innovation, and they provide this amazing bridge between the two of them. So that in-between role is actually amazing if you know how to navigate it. Now the Yungas we know are the descendants of the Moches who begin to come down. They go down further south in Peru. So we're now close to what is the current capital of Lima. And then they meet the Yaoyos. And the Yaoyos are another group of people who are fleeing from the mountains. So the Yaoyos had some contact with the mountain cultures. We already know they didn't like them that much. And the Yaoyos and the Yungas have a really fraught relationship around the 10th century, just about 1,000 years ago. And then they make peace. Okay, now this is really interesting, and now I'm going to go back to Thor Heyerdahl's idea of the rainbow. The Yungas and the Yaoyos lived together and live together, and they are two separate peoples. And they maintain their own cultures. And their vision of what we would call multiculturalism is not a melting pot. They are not the same. They live together, and they maintain their differentness, and they live in peace. Okay, I just want you to think about these ideas, because sometimes we think that our models are the only ones. There are many different models. And I have to tell you, that model has worked for them beautifully for 1,000 years, and it continues to work for them. And it worked for them after the collapse of the Inca Empire. When the Incas collapsed, they didn't. The Yungas and the Yaoyos kept on fighting the conquest. And when the great liberator San Martin came from Argentina to free Peru, it was the Yungas and the Yaoyos who were the first Indians of Peru to meet with him and join the liberating armies. So something works in that model, and I just want you to think about it, because here in the States, you know, many of you who may have had parents who spoke another language, or grandparents. A lot of times they didn't want to speak that language with you because they wanted you to be American. Well, being American can also be speaking more than one language. Okay, but there are different models, so think about that. And now think about the five-armed sex goddess, who definitely was a help in getting people to live together. It's enough for the intellect. Now let's go a little bit farther down. They merged their gods. The rain gods of the Yaoyos and the earth gods of the Yungas. And we see that Chaupiñamca, the five-armed sex goddess, is in a way a kind of manifestation of the earlier Sian. How many arms did Sian have? 4. Remember? She has 4. Now they add 1 arm. Now think of the number 5 here, because for Yungas and Yaoyos, 5 is the sacred number. So Chaupiñamca has 5 arms. The better to satisfy a man, I'm not going to go into it. Can I go into it? You can have your imagination. So she's got 5 arms. And her brother, Pariacacta, who satisfies women, can become 5 men at once. I'm not going to go into it. So, interesting. Why do you think the number 5 might be the sacred number? What is usually, give me some sacred numbers. Let's throw some sacred numbers out. From any mythology you know.
7.
7, okay. 7 is a very big sacred number for Jews, for Christians. Why? Because we have our mutual story of creation. The 7 days or phases of creation. Give me some more numbers.
3.
4? Kendra there in the back? 3. Hugely important in Celtic tradition, in Christian tradition, in Hindu tradition. Okay, well there's also a trinity. Brahma, Shiva, Vishnu.
What about 9?
9 is very important in Kabbalistic Jewish tradition and in the tradition of the Mayas, where the underworld has 9 levels.
8 to the Chinese.
8 to the Chinese, the Eightfold Path from Taoism and from Buddhism.
13.
13 is a sacred number for Jews and for Mayans. In Jewish tradition, 13 is the age of maturity, the age at which one becomes an adult, or one can differentiate between good and evil. And for the Mayas, 13 is their levels of heaven.
5 pillars of Islam.
Thank you. This is important. I'm talking about Judaism and Christianity. See why I keep her around? Kendra, when I was a child, before you were born, there was a really obnoxious ad for a medicine called Geritol. You're not going to have seen this ad, but it was really obnoxious and really sexist. Do you remember it, women?
Yes.
My wife. I think I'll keep her.
Lord's will.
My husband. I think I'll throw him in the trash bin. I was going to say Kendra. I think I'll keep her. Kendra, thank you for bringing in Islam, because it's not just the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. Thank you very much for remembering and reminding us of that. Islam has the 5 pillars of ethics in Islam. And in Native American cultures of the moon, the sacred directions are 5, not 4. So let's do them in Quechua, since we're in Peru. Chinchay Suyu is the north. Suyu means a quarter. So you get the whole term Tawantin Suyu, which means the 4 quarters. Which is also, by the way, what the native peoples of the Southwest call this area. Land of the 4 quarters. So Chinchay Suyu is the north. Conde Suyu is the west. Anti Suyu is the east. Koya Suyu is the south. And then you have the center. The center is the 5th direction. That's the most sacred. It's wherever you are. Okay, now this idea is very important among the lunar cultures, because what they say is when you practice healing, when you have to heal yourself physically or emotionally, that healing must begin wherever you are. Understand that? Right? So we can't say, if God forbid you're an alcoholic, I'll start my healing tomorrow. It has to start now. You know, when Native American shamans work with somebody who is mentally disturbed, the first thing they try to do is to bring them to their center. You are here. You don't understand why they say that. It's because when you have to heal yourself, the first step is accepting where you are right now. You don't like where you are right now? First accept it, and then you can go on. You can't say, no, I'll do that in a week when things are better. That week never comes. Shakespeare said that, right? Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow comes on its petty pace from day to day. So all great philosophy basically tells us the same thing. So she has 5 arms. For each one of the center, for each one of the directions, and for the center, and don't ask me what she does with them. But the Yaoyos were so happy with the idea of Chowpinyamka, they come together with the Yungas, because she's originally a Yunga goddess, because she comes from Sian, the Moche goddess. And the Yaoyos and the Yungas end their fighting, and they have a yearly festival dedicated to Chowpinyamka and her 5-faceted brother, who was the god of the Yaoyos, Pariakakta. So it was a beautiful way, in a way, to make peace. We put our gods together. And as I was chewing off Kendra's ear while she's finding beautiful pictures for me, this is what we do all day. I wish it was what we did. I wish it was what we did all day. I tell her beautiful stories. She shows me beautiful art. And sometimes we have this awful thing called administration we have to do, and we both get in a really bad mood. But when we're doing what we want to do, which is the education, so we also speak a lot. And Kendra reminded me, because I am very focused on the New World, and she reminded me of the Old World, the owl goddess, Kendra reminded me of Athena. Whoa! Let's think about that. Because, particularly interesting, guys, if I'm going to extend that German anthropologist, Free Heyerdahl, the one who kind of gave Heyerdahl some of his ideas, Max Uhle, his solar lunar ideas now to the Old World, well, the Romans are more solar. The Greeks would be slightly more lunar. The Greeks would actually be a lot more lunar. Isn't it interesting that in Greek society, then, we have the idea of the owl goddess, the goddess of wisdom. Okay? Thank you, Kendra, for reminding me that Europe exists. I know I forget this. I'm always banging on about people forgetting about the Americas. Kendra keeps my balance. So our lunar culture is less aggressive than solar ones. Well, before I continue, I want to hear some of your thoughts. Till now, we're dead center right now.
Well, I always think of the Moche as being very warlike, and it comes principally from their ceramics.
The ceramics are both very violent and erotic as hell. I don't even want to start to describe their ceramics because I would not take a child to see them. And the first time I saw their ceramics, the kind of jovial Peruvian guard said to me, because I was with a family and their younger children, you might want to leave the kids outside. And after about 2 minutes in there, we walked the kids outside. So you have a very interesting point. Now here's something that the Junga of today will tell you. The same way you cannot judge Western culture by, say, Picasso's art, you know, do people really have 5 noses in the West? If I was going to judge Western culture by art, do we melt clocks? Is Salvador Dali's art? Do things really look like that? If they do, go to a therapist very quickly. So there are abstract images as well in Native American art, and the Moche were very fond of these wildly abstract, erotic and violent images, which are usually anatomically impossible, and often involve large sea crabs. I'm not going to go into that. The Moche fought all the time. Remember, lunar cultures are not pacifistic, but they don't conquer other cultures. So what did you have among the Moche? You know who the Moche would have been comfortable with? Not the nasty conquistador culture of Spain from the 16th century, but they would have been very comfortable with medieval Iberian culture before Spain was Spain, and you had different kingdoms, and you had champions like El Cid, yeah, or in France, Roland, because it was like 2 knights fighting. If you're trying to understand Moche culture, you have to understand early medieval European culture, not the later nation-based culture of the early modern period. Go back to before the time of the nation-state. Is that hard for us to do? We're so used to the nation-state. The nation-state begins at the end of the 15th century. Spain is one of the places it begins. But human history had gone on for a hell of a long time before we come up with this idea of the monolithic nation state in the empire. So Moche fought each other all the time, individual warriors fighting each other.
What did they fight about if they didn't fight about land?
The same thing that medieval knights did, prowess and honor. So if you want to understand Moche culture, I would recommend a medieval Spanish chivalric romance, Amadis of Gaul, or Tirante lo Blanco, or in English, pick up Sir Thomas Malory. Okay, because it is more Lancelot whacking it off to Gawain. Yeah, they whack it off. Well, I'm sorry, now I'm thinking in Spanish, whack it off in English, that's another thing. Please eliminate that. Sorry. Whacking Gawain on the head rather than whacking it off. Sorry. My English goes after 7 p.m. Lancelot and Gawain in the Arthurian legend do not like each other. And they're always fighting each other, but they're not fighting each other over land. They're fighting each other over honor. So Moche warriors would fight each other over honor. And what's interesting, and I just throw this into you because, of course, this is also something that both Ule and Heyerdahl noticed coming, as they both did from Scandinavia. This may be one reason why early Native American contacts with the Norse were much better than the later contacts with Europeans of a later time. Because the way the Vikings fought for individual honor, yeah, you could, most of the time. It was easier to understand that than the imperial philosophy with which the Spanish, the English, and everybody else show up in the late 15th century. So internal conflict, yes, all the time. And when you look at Moche art, which is extraordinary, and thank you for mentioning it because I want to point out to you, if any of you have heard nonsense that there was no portraiture in Native American art, you must look at Moche art. They were specialists of face portraiture, and it's extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary. And they did fight, but not on a national level. It was one warrior fighting another. So for example, the same way I want to teach my Western students about non-Western literature, when I was back in Argentina and I would teach my Argentine students about Western literature, what would my native students prefer? Did they like the European literature of the Renaissance or the Middle Ages? Middle Ages. So it's much closer to our culture. That's interesting. So internal conflict, yes. Empire building, no. Conflict was based on personal honor, military prowess, and now let's take a look at that clan exploits. Remember, these were matriarchal clans. So in lunar cultures, it's your mother who determines what your clan is. Now, that always struck me as interesting because since, as many of you know, I'm a Sephardic Jew, a Jew of Spanish background. I still have that thing with Spain. You know that Jewish culture is lunar. We use a lunar calendar. And you know that in Jewish culture, Judaism is transmitted through whom? The mother. Only the mother. Or you convert. Convert to Judaism, that's fine. But if your father was Muslim and your mother is Jewish, in Jewish tradition you're Jewish. And in Muslim tradition you're Muslim. Would you like to know a very conflictive example of that? The former dictator of Libya, Muammar al-Gaddafi. His mother was a Libyan Jewess. There's a very famous Italian journalist by the name of Oriana Fallaci who knew that, and when interviewing Muammar al-Gaddafi one day, asked him about that, and he said, yeah, he had no conflict. It seemed strange to her. From an Islamic point of view, it is the father. From the Jewish point of view, it is the mother. So that's just interesting when you have intermarriages and, you know, identity becomes a complicated thing. The clans of the lunar cultures in the New World went through the mother. But if you were Aztec or Inca, who did it go through? Father. Aztec or Inca. Those are the militant empire-building cultures of the New World. Daddy. I went through Daddy. Very, very famous 17th century writer of Peru, El Inca Garcilaso. His mother was a former Inca princess. His father was a Spanish conquistador. And so although he called himself mestizo, which is a mixture of both, what was he regarded as? Where did he end up living? España. Okay? Because Spanish culture at that point had become patriarchal. In the nicer medieval period, it was much more matriarchal. And now here's something I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. Spiders, peanuts, and tears of the moon. Obviously. So, lunar symbolism for the Moche and for the Yunga and Yaoyo peoples of today. Spiders are important. They're not yucky. Right? And you know, our symbology is way too influenced by Hollywood. Ooh, spiders, ooh yes, Halloween. Spiders are amazing creatures, and in many native cultures and in many West African cultures, we have the story of Anansi, the industrious spider. A spider is a symbol of work, because that spider is always doing something. It's spinning its web, it's industrious. So the spider is a symbol of energy, and it's the spider in traditional Moche and then later Yunga, modern day Yunga culture, who when a person dies, spins the web for the soul to follow, to get back to Sian, to the moon goddess. And Sian weeps for the person's family. She doesn't weep for the person because the soul is happy. The soul is coming back to her. Death is hard for the ones who stay. Many times, I'm sure we've all had experiences with it. The one who goes is okay. It's the ones who are left. We're hurting. So Sian cries for us. But she promises all of us that spiritually we will burst again like the peanut, which I hope you know is a new world food. So in traditional Moche and modern day Yunga culture in Peru, their sacred images are spiders, peanuts, and tears of the moon. Okay? Very interesting collection of symbols. And I think a nicer way to look at spiders. Okay, we have a kind of inborn dislike of, ooh, yuck, they're insects. Well, insects are amazing. We need them ecologically, too. Pachamama, Pachacama, and Waco. This is one of the most disturbing lunar solar stories I'm going to tell you. Any questions about anything? Yeah, go for it.
I wanted to go back to the art that you displayed,
You want me to go back?
and the idea that it is very exaggerated in some.
I would say
ways.
exaggerated, I would say abstract. Like Picasso's image of Dora
okay.
with the 5 noses. No
I-
woman actually has 5 noses.
I was thinking more, was there a connection with, or not a connection, but a parallel with, for instance, the costumes that the Greeks wore on stage?
Very much so, because the Moche, thank you for mentioning that, the Moche, the Inca, the Maya still in Central America, the Yaoyo still in Peru, have a very active tradition of theater. And they had their own traditional theater. The Spanish chroniclers wrote about it. They banned it at the end of the 16th century, but they kept on performing the plays secretly after independence in Peru and Argentina. San Martin, who was a wonderful renegade Spaniard who freed our countries, liberated them again, and the theater pieces were performed, and they are performed. There's a huge tradition of theater. And so many of the images you're looking at, like this Moche warrior, were worn literally on the stage. By the way, the traditional word for a Native American theater piece in Peru is called a huanca. And the huancas are performed all over Peru in both the native languages, in Quechua, in other native languages, and in Spanish. They've all been translated into Spanish. Thank you for mentioning that.
Do these cultures have a shamanistic background also?
Completely. Are you guys all familiar with the term shamanism? So shamanic cultures tend to be cultures where the ruler, whether it's the chief or the king or the queen, has limited power because the spiritual advisor, like the owl goddess or the prophet in biblical culture, limits the power of the ruler. That's number one. So the greatest power is considered spiritual power and not royal power. Royal power is there, but it's put in its place. And in shamanic culture, everything is considered changeable. So, for example, thank you for asking this question. A Yunga teacher that I know in Peru once said to me, it's very hard for Western people to accept the fact that we believe that a human being, a shaman, can become a jaguar. You know, that's a very famous image in Latin American symbology, the jaguar. And the jaguar is a symbol of masculine power and also of protection. The jaguar will protect his tribe. But you speak about cancer, and cancer are cells mutating. Well, that's very difficult for us to understand. This idea of transformation, negative or positive. In shamanic culture, your physicality is very temporary, and your spiritual essence will undergo many, many physical changes. So this doesn't fit well with the solar kingdoms, because of course in solar kingdoms, the king, his body is inviolate. Think of France at the end of the 17th century, Louis XIV, the Sun King. His body was considered holy. Think of the Inca emperors.
The Japanese emperor.
Think of the Japanese emperor. Think of the pharaoh. When you believe, when you have the solar concept, whether you are Louis XIV, or the Japanese emperor, or the Egyptian pharaoh, or the Inca king, your body is inviolate. When you are a shaman, your body is changeable. You can look like a human being, you can look like a jaguar. Everything is changeable because the sacred symbol is the moon, and the moon changes. Very, very good question.
So going on with that question,
Mm-hmm.
does that connect then to, for instance, I know here in Arizona, our natives, their clan, and the ancestor of that clan was usually
An animal.
An animal, yes, a shape
The
changer.
totem, exactly.
Yes.
Because the idea is, you know, they have a beautiful term, our four-legged brothers. Okay, so they do not view human beings as separate from animals. No physical anthropologist does. You know, when David Attenborough talked about birds, he always reminds human beings, we are part of what he calls the great and wonderful animal family. And for many native civilizations, animals also have souls. Now, let me not make a generalization. For the Aztecs and the Incas, no. Because as solar civilizations, just like European solar civilizations, the human being was supreme. For the lunar civilizations, the human being is together with all the animal souls. So that's a difference. That's a very interesting difference. Ms. Kendra reminding me I can't speak to you all night. Okay. Pachamama, Pachacama, and Wakum. Okay. Listen quickly to an extremely disturbing story where you're going to see now sun and moon literally fighting each other. Pachacamac is the animator of the world. That's what the name means. Pacha is space-time in Quechua. Kamak is the life force, so the life force of the world, represented as a male deity. Pachamama, the earth itself. Wakon. Wakon is a nasty solar deity, of course, the deity of fire. What happens here? Stories are used to teach people how social behaviors. One social behavior you could not tolerate in a tribal society is rape. It destroys the girl or the boy. It destroys the social fabric. What happens in this story? Pachacamac falls in love with the beautiful Pachamama, and one day while they are making love, it's such ardent lovemaking, they roll over a cliff, and he falls into the sea, and he dies. She is left alone, and she weeps, and she has two children, two little twins we're going to call Wilka. Wilka in Quechua means sacred or holy. and she's left alone crying, and the weather suddenly becomes very stormy and very horrible, and she has to take her children and find a safe place. So she leaves the sea because, according to the myth, a wall of water has come up. What is that? That's tsunami. Okay, and Peru has gotten its fair share of tsunamis. And she flees into the mountains. Do you see the story again? Civilization begins in the sea, goes into the mountains. And there's a gut-wrenching segment where she's wandering with her children in the snow, and then they see fire from afar. And she thinks, okay, fire. That should be safe. There should be a house there. My children will get some warmth. So they follow the fire, but unfortunately, that is the site of the fire god Wakon, who is portrayed as a really nasty mountain lion on fire. But he's all there is, and he promises he'll take care of them. And she's at her wit's end, and the children need to be fed, so he makes a soup for them. And then he tells the children, will you please go out and get us some water? Your mother's thirsty. Of course, the children adore their mother, and they go out and take the gourd and get the water, and while they're gone, he rapes the Pachamama. And then he kills her. And he dismembers her body and sends it to the four corners of the world. The children come back. They don't know what's happened. Where's their mother? He tells them, your mother will come back, don't worry. But in the night, a fox. The fox is always very good in Andean mythology. And the fox is intelligent. Something that connects him with foxes in French medieval mythology. Or have you never heard of Reynardine? Right? So the fox, Anyas. The Andean Reynardine is Anyas. Anyas says to the kids, come over here, come over here. I have to tell you something horrible. You shouldn't trust Wakon. He killed your mother. You have to get out of here. You have to get out of here. I'll send you to my wife. Okay, Mrs. Anyas is waiting for you up in the mountains. She'll take care of you. The kids don't believe it. They don't want to believe it. And then a bird comes. Again, the bird. Okay? And the bird will save them. And the bird, called the Huachai in Quechua, says, no, the fox is telling you the truth. So the children are saved by the animals. Do you see now that connection in shamanistic cultures? The animals are your brothers, and they flee. And the foxes and the birds protect them. And Wakon now comes running out, asking all of the animals, where are they? And of course the animals collaborate with the kids, and they say they went that way, so he keeps on going the wrong way. And the children hide with Mrs. Anyas, who saves them by giving them her own blood. She nurses the children. Should this be reminding you also of some ancient European stories? Romulus and Remus, okay? Right? The wolf child of Aveyron in France, yeah? Okay, so we see people, as Thor Heyerdahl said, some of you have heard me give this quote before, people are monotonously similar. You thinking, oh, this is so exotic. No, people get really repetitious. So at one point, unfortunately, Wakon catches up with him, and he starts to scream to the little Wilka, the girl, I'm going to do to you what I did to Pachamama. And the children are terrified, and the female fox says, I'll save you, I'll save you. And she hides the children and says to Wakon, sing, Wakon, if you sing, the children will hear your powerful voice, and they'll come out, and they'll run to you. And he sings, and what does his singing produce? The earthquake. Okay, now do you understand how Peruvian society will equate the rapist with the earthquake, which is the most feared and horrible event in Latin America? Or do I have to remind you of Chile and Colombia and what happened in Mexico, oh my God, in 1985? Okay, there is nothing more horrifying than an earthquake. Do you see now the kind of social message given here? You don't behave that way, that's bad. So Wakon is a rapist and a criminal, and also, thank God, he's stupid. So he starts singing, and he produces his own earthquake. Bye-bye. And now the two foxes that have saved the children say to the children, you can stay with us, but the children miss their parents. And so the foxes, they're really good foxes, they turn up to Pachacamac in heaven and to Pachamama in earth below and say, take them back, they're your children, we've kept them for you, we've adopted them for you, now they have to go back to you. And Pachacamac and Pachamama thank the foxes, and they bless the foxes. So foxes are good in lunar cultures. And Pachacamac throws a celestial rope down from heaven and the children climb up, and what do they become? The sun and the moon. The hero twins become the sun and the moon. If you ever read Mayan literature, you know in the Popol Vuh, the hero twins also become the sun and the moon. Pachamama and Vichama. Now here's another story from the same area. And now we have the sun god blatantly as the rival to Pachacamac. They fight over the Pachamama. And now it's declared it's the sun god, it's Inti. Wakon is a fire god, he's on the way to being a sun god. And they get very angry and they kill the child who's the offspring, Vichama. And Vichama is murdered and resurrected. I want you to see that this idea of a resurrected God is also a universal concept. That shouldn't take away from whatever religion you believe in. I think there's something really quite beautiful about seeing religious commonality. You don't have to be afraid of it. And Vichama is resurrected, and then Vichama will resurrect the Pachamama, who died in the midst of this horrible battle between lunar and solar gods. So maybe you understand that's also a message saying to stop the fighting. And when she is resurrected, and Vichama is resurrected, they produce 3 eggs. Okay? And humanity comes from these eggs. But now we have a class system coming in. We have the gold egg for the priests, of course, the temple priests. We have the silver egg for the nobility, and then we have all of us copper eggs. All the eggs are important. Together they all make an omelet, but yeah, there is already a class differentiation that is coming in because the solar cultures are in there already, and that's where you get the class differentiation. Something very interesting, though, before I leave the eggs. You may not know, and you'll know now, some of you may know already, there are a lot of dinosaur bones in the Andes and all throughout the Argentine Pampa. In fact, one of the weirdest dinosaurs discovered in the past 10 years was discovered in the Argentine Pampa. We had all these crazy articles in the Argentine newspapers. Un dinosaurio argentino, an Argentine dinosaur. You kind of saw him dressed for a tango. He looked like a bird. You know that dinosaurs and birds. Mm-hmm. So in the Andes specifically, the Andes, any paleontologist will tell you, is the biggest pterodactyl cemetery in the world. I was going to ask you, have you ever seen a pterodactyl? Seen a pterodactyl?
Yes, Jurassic Park.
You're drinking too much. You know the pterodactyl, the big ugly dinosaurs that flew, right? So it turns out paleontologists have found the most of them in the Andes. Or the most pterodactyls that they found in the Andes. Well, guess what? The peoples of the Andes have been digging up fossils for a long time. And among the sacred items of all the native peoples of the Andes, you find dinosaur fossils. And they found dinosaur eggs, and they found fossilized pterodactyls. They're very aware of this connection with birds. So what you're going to find is that outside of the solar cultures, which just like our solar cultures want to believe that God created them separately, for the lunar cultures, we're all hatched from eggs. Remember vampires, the first time I came here. Now, getting back to our lovely friend's question about the Moche, were they peaceful, were they violent? Well, now let's look at their art, because the main deity is Ayapec, and Ayapec is a vampire, and Ayapec sucks blood, but Ayapec does that symbolically. The idea is, if you are a warrior, you must promise your blood to Ayapec, and you must fight to show your prowess, the same way 2 medieval knights will. Yes, he looks like he needs a dentist. It's an extraordinary image, the Moche mask. Is it frightening? Well, if we get our Hollywood conceptions out of our heads, no. It is an image of, what is that? It's a human and a jaguar, okay? The jaguar teeth, but the jaguar for the peoples of the Andes is a protective animal. When a man defends his family, he's called jaguar con flor, jaguar with a flower. Okay, because he has the tenderness to care about his wife and children and his parents, but he'll fight like a jaguar if they're attacked. So don't look at it as something that horrible. Atahualpa, the last Inca, the one who was killed by Francisco Pizarro, adopted some of the images of the lunar peoples whom he conquered. And all of the Spanish chroniclers agree that when Pizarro saw him for the first time in Cajamarca, he was covered by an extraordinary cloak of very beautiful material that even Pizarro thought was silk. It was vampire bat wings. And this is part of, this goes actually into Inca iconography. If any of you visit a magnificent museum in Denver, the Denver Art Museum, go to the 4th floor. They have one of the most extraordinary collections of Inca art in the world. And you will see they're called the nail pieces of the Inca. The Inca kings adopted this image from the Moches. They're like golden thimbles with long, very pointed nails. And the Inca kings would sit with their hands crossed on those pointed nails, replicating this image of the vampire bat.
Did the Moche do that too?
Yes, the Moche did it too. The Incas took that directly from the Moche. If you go into the Andes, there are kind of funny stories about fat-sucking vampires.
I want one.
You want one? It's cheaper than the post-suction. It's called a jaro siri, and it does not suck your blood, it sucks your fat. Now here's the thing, you cannot tell it only suck 2 inches. If it starts, it doesn't stop. So, but in the Andes, the essence of life is considered to be fat. Okay, so if you have an inch or 2 extra, you know in Spanish we use the term gordita, which actually in English sounds terrible, little fatty, but it's a compliment. If a Latin guy says that to you, if somebody says that to me, it's not an insult to me, because it means you've got something to hold on to. No, see, anorexic is not fashionable in Latin America. Women, now you know where we should all go. So sea peoples and sun peoples, did the Incas sail the Pacific? Did they have any contact with the lunar people? Well, we know one of their last kings did. The 10th Inca, Tupac Yupanqui, who was every bit as much of a conquistador as the Spaniards who will come later, conquered almost all the lunar cultures. They hated him. Oh, they hated him. But he dominated them, and he had the Inca Empire essentially dominate them for the next 70 years. He also extended his empire seaward, which kind of connects him with the Spaniards, and he got as far as Easter Island. He appropriated the Moche symbolism, as you see, and these were the 2 islands where we know he reached, because we have Inca architecture on those islands. Easter Island. Okay, the big island and the smaller one, Nina Chumbi and Avachumbi, as they are called in Quechua. When the Spanish showed up in the 16th century, they heard that the Incas had crossed the sea, but you know, European pride couldn't allow anybody else to cross the sea other than Europeans. People, the Incas were no less imperialist, and they crossed the sea in those boats that Thor Heyerdahl later crossed the entire Pacific in. Remember the boat he called Kon-Tiki? When he proved, yes, the Inca boats could sail. So, Peruvian culture, we see, as we get to the end, is an amalgam of many cultures. We have the mountain cultures, the solar cultures, but they're latecomers. The stars and the plants and the Polynesian imagery is what forms the base of Peruvian culture. If we look at this Moche image, this is an image from a very famous Moche engraving, and I want to point out what you're looking at. So look closely. Do you notice that all the Moche princes in this engraving, it's kind of machista engraving, I guess the owl goddess had better things to do with that. It's like, I'll let the boys have their guy hour. You notice that all the men are holding what looks like, we call it in Spanish, it's a mate. It's that thing Argentines drink out of. It looks like a little vase, and it's actually a gourd, and it has grass in it, what we call yerba, and it's a very powerful diuretic, and it also has a lot of caffeine, and we drink mate, and this is the way the coca leaf was also ingested. Now this is coca, not cocaine. Please do not confuse it. Because the coca leaf is a sacred leaf in the Andes. They do not make cocaine out of it. It does not produce any hallucinations. It is an offering to the Pachamama. And that is what they're doing. They are preparing the coca leaf. Okay, you have to be very careful about confusing. Don't confuse coca with cocaine. Cocaine is what, in the 20th century, unfortunately, people will make out of the coca leaf. But the coca leaf itself is a tea and used for soap and is a sacred offering in the Andes. So we see this connection now between the Pacific, the lunar cultures, and the origins of what we call Andean civilization. Now, we have to thank, before we thank, we're going to go Muyakocha. We do have to thank a number of people here. But first, let's put it together. The gods, goddesses, men and women of Huarochiri. Do you remember? I mentioned that at the beginning. Pariacacta, Chalpiñamca, the five-armed goddess, and her brother Pariacacta, and they come together. This is the lake Muyakocha, where a particular type of sea urchin is found called spondylus. Now, it's not native to the lake. It was brought in from the Pacific. Okay, remember, these are cultures. Remember the Yuncas and the Yauyos. This is where they live. They are dead in between the mountains and the lakes. And this is the lake where a very important decision is made. The rain god, remember, water, lunar is good, fights the fire sun god, Walayu Karawinchu. The rain god wins almost. That enables him to abolish human sacrifice, because what they fight over in that lake is human sacrifice. The fire god says, I want you to give me a live child, and Pariacacta, the rain god, says, no way. And he wins, almost. Human sacrifice ends, and instead of giving your child to the god for sacrificing your child in war, you give spondylus. You give the sea urchin. That's the offering. But the fire god doesn't go away altogether. He's still there, and so you have to continue the ongoing battle. And it's kind of the message that the peoples of the sea give us, that there is no happy end. It's an ongoing fight. And you just have to continue it. And speaking of spondylus, people, we really want to thank you for your support. And these programs, we also want to thank you for paying, for coming to this. We in Poison Pen thank you. We have many, many programs. Some are paying, many are free. And it's very important for us that before you leave, first of all, if you didn't pay, I repeat, you will be beheaded in nastiest Spanish conquistador, Aztec, and Inca style. We're going to get really solar with those who didn't pay. Please go to the back and give in your $10, because this does cost money for both ACMRS and Poison Pen. We also have many free events. We'd like you to take a look at them at the back. Kendra has created a lovely table for us of all of our materials, which will give you an idea of a tremendous range of things that we're doing. If you haven't signed up, please sign up on our sheets back there so you can get, so Kendra can start deluging you with endless all ongoing activities, which are wonderful. We want to thank you all. We want to thank Poison Pen. Can we all have a hand for Poison Pen? Wonderful, guys. Thank you, Jess and everybody.